Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar this afternoon, Recreation in Parks and the new Community Benefits Charge Framework. We have more attendees joining all along, so we will get underway. Just before we start the presentation today, my name is Diane English and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Communications for Parks and Recreation Ontario. We have a few technical things to go through for the webinar. If I can make my slides work properly today. Apparently I can't. There we go. All right, so here are some information for your Zoom controls. If you have technical issues or you just want to say hello to your colleagues, please use the chat box and be sure that you have selected all panelists and attendees. We have a lot of information to get through today, so please use the chat box to put your questions in. We'll stop for questions a few times during the presentation today. And if you see a question in the chat box that you think is a good one, you can use the thumbs up feature to upvote it, and we'll be sure that we get to that question before the end of the webinar. And the most common question we get is, will today's session be recorded and will the slides be available? The answer to that question is yes and yes. As an attendee, you will receive a link to a recording of this webinar as well as to the slides following this, so you can share it with the information with your colleagues. So I'd like now to get underway and to introduce our three panelists for today. Pleased to welcome Craig Binning, who's a partner with Hemson Consulting Limited. Anne-Marie Nasser is the Director of Parks Development and Capital Planning with the City of Toronto. And Steve Langlois is Principal Planner with Monteith Brown Planning Consultants. So thank you to the three of you for joining us. This is incredibly important changes for our sector in terms of planning and acquisition of land and capital planning for parks and recreation. So I'm going to hand it over now to Craig, and I'm going to just move the slide. And Craig is going to give us an overview of the legislative and regulatory changes. Anne-Marie will be talking about the impact on municipalities, and Steve will be delving more into parkland dedication and the new legislation. So I hand control over now to Craig for the first part of our presentation.
Great, thanks, Diane. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon virtually, and I'm very pleased with the panelists that I'm on with today. Two very experienced individuals, and I think collectively, hopefully, will give you a sense of how things are changing under the new legislative framework. The title of the slide deck suggests that we're focusing in on CBC's, the new Community Benefits Charge. However, we're taking a broader perspective and looking at the various tools that are available to fund parks and recreation infrastructure, at least the development-related components. There's been really important changes over the last 18 months, and I want to start and probably end my presentation just to say that these changes are very positive for municipalities and very positive for parks and recreation departments. It looks far better than it did a year ago when the legislation looked like it was going to decrease the amount of funding that we would receive through development charges and other mechanisms. I can say now that we're in a better position than we were under the previous legislations, and certainly much better off than what was initially proposed. So with respect to development charges, there has been some scoping of things, and some municipal services have been removed, but none that you're probably particularly concerned about. Parking, cemeteries, and airports mostly are gone. But the balance of the soft services, in particular indoor recreation and park development, have been reinforced within the development charge framework, and they're also now 100% fundable under the Development Charges Act, no more 10% discount. Likewise, the introduction of the new Community Benefits Charge under Section 37 of the Planning Act introduces some new opportunities for some municipalities, and I'll touch on that in a few minutes. It's important to recognize that CBCs can only be applied against high-density developments, and they do replace the old density bonusing provisions that some of your municipalities would have used in the past. Let's make sure I can. So this slide is basically saying the same thing. We're just identifying what those three tools are. So the Development Charges Act will likely continue to be the prime source of money for yourselves for the provision of park recreation facilities, including the land, and for the development of parkland. And once again, it's for the initial round of capital costs associated with meeting increased needs arising from development. Parkland acquisition that Steve's going to speak extensively to, it's really important that those rules have been reinforced. Initially, it looked like there were going to be some changes to that, and including the alternative rate continues to be applicable and enforced with some additional rules around how we have to implement those and some public processes. And then finally, there's this new community benefits charge, which is largely untested, as we haven't had any studies undertaken to date. It really is only going to apply to higher density developments, and that's a building with 5 or more stories and has 10 or more residential units. And the charge will be capped at 4% of the land value. That doesn't mean that the charge will necessarily be expressed as a percentage of land value, but it will be capped at that on an individual development application. So I'm hoping that most of you are familiar with development charges, but just really quickly, it is the prime fiscal tool available to municipalities to fund what we refer to as that initial round of capital costs associated with meeting the increased needs arising from development. The idea or the mantra often for municipalities is that growth should pay for growth, and that the financing of that new infrastructure shouldn't place an undue burden upon existing ratepayers. Development charges and these other tools will never fund 100% of the development related impacts, but we have a very strong regime here in Ontario, much stronger than elsewhere across the country, and they play a very important part in the funding of capital infrastructure, especially as it relates to recreation and parks. I'm not going to spend too much time on this overview of the Act, just to stress a couple of things. Bylaws have a maximum life of 5 years to them. There's restrictions on how services can be included, and I'm going to touch on a couple of critical points for yourselves. Charges can be established on what we refer to as a municipal-wide basis or an area-specific basis. For the most part, parks and recreation are done on a municipal-wide basis, with an important exception in the city of Ottawa, where there is some area rating of parks. One important thing for yourselves is that these are dedicated reserve funds. So when monies are collected for the purposes of recreation and park, they go into a separate reserve and they can only be spent for those purposes. So it's nice that you've got the security of the money coming in, and it allows you to do concrete long-range planning. There's some other provisions about credits and front-ending agreements that we don't need to get into this afternoon. So as I indicated, there's been some changes to the legislation. Under the original Development Charges Act in 1989, and even the original 1997 legislation, didn't give us a definitive list of prescribed services. It basically allowed us to fund where there were development-related impacts and provided some services that weren't eligible for funding. With the changes that have occurred over the last year, we now have a prescriptive list of services about what can be funded from development charges. As I alluded to earlier, original variations of the legislation had all of the soft services, including parks and recreation, removed from the development charge funding into the new community benefits charge. That has reverted now back to having parks and recreation clearly in the development charge funding framework, with the exception of the acquisition of parkland, which has always been excluded from development charges because of the Planning Act provisions. This list just gives you an idea about the other services that are considered in most development charge bylaws, depending upon the service delivery responsibility of your municipality. One point that I just want to very quickly make is that there was a new provision passed that came into effect on January 1st of this year, and it's about when rates get established and when rates get paid. It's not maybe of critical importance to you, but for some of your capital planning, it might be, because what happens now is that when a developer comes in with an application for a site plan or a subdivision, their rates get frozen at the time that they submit a complete application, even though they're not payable until the issuance of the first building permit. And they have 2 years from the time at which council approves that plan to pull those permits. What can happen then is they can get a rate that's frozen, And then a municipality might do an update, which could increase and often does the rates, but the development will pay a lower rate. And that can impact upon your capital funding. We can levy some interest charges, and we're looking at ways to modify the calculation, but there's potentially some impacts. There's also some deferral payments for certain types of development, but they're not going to fundamentally affect your cash flow, I don't think, from the recreation and parks side of things. This is an overview schematic of a development charge study that we use. And at a very high level, what we do is we say, how much is the municipality going to grow by over a certain planning horizon? And we usually use 10 years for parks and recreation services. Then there's a really important step that says we can't establish development charge rates at a level greater than the way in which the municipality has provided the service on average over the last 10 years. And this often becomes a limiting funding factor for recreation and park services. And so I'm going to talk about it in a moment, but it's really important that when you're participating in a development charge background study, that you spend a lot of time getting that inventory correct and quantifying as much as you can, because it impacts on how much you can fund moving forward. Then what happens is you identify what the capital needs are. So what needs do you have to meet the increased costs arising from development? So development's occurring, you're going to have to add new recreation facilities, develop more parkland. What are those needs? And then we have to make some deductions from it. Grants and subsidies, if there's a benefit to the existing community, that has to be removed. Consideration of where your existing development charge reserve fund is. And then if you're exceeding the funding envelope, we may need to push some of the costs into recovery beyond the 10 years. What that then leaves us with is the share of the capital program that is related to development and fundable from development charges. And then we typically apportion it between residential growth and non-residential growth. For most of the studies done by Hempson Consulting, we apportion 100% of the cost of recreation and parks to the residential sector. There are some studies in some municipalities where there's a minor apportionment to the non-residential sector, say 5 or 10%. And then residential charges are expressed and collected based upon what we call built form, like a single detached unit or a townhouse unit or an apartment unit, and they're differentiated to reflect the needs arising from those different types of development. Non-residential charges are calculated on a per square meter of gross floor area basis. These are some of the key legislative steps. And once again, I'm just going to leave that slide with you and you'll get the slide deck. And if you have any questions on it, I'd be pleased to answer at the end, or you can always send me an email. Basically, what's required is a public process where there's a release of a background study, and it's got to be out a minimum of 2 weeks before the formal public meeting and 60 days prior to when the new bylaw is going to be passed. Another important thing to note is that development charge bylaws are appealable to LPAT. And so there's always a lot of rigor to ensure that the background studies and the bylaws meet all of the statutory requirements. Some key takeaways about the development charge study for yourselves is you should be finding out and asking if your municipality is planning on undertaking a development charge update study sometime in the next year. Many of them will be proceeding for a variety of reasons, and you want to make sure that you're on that team and that you're actively part of it from the very beginning. As I alluded to earlier, historical inventories are critical. There's a very direct relationship between how good a job you do at quantifying what infrastructure you have and what the value of those assets are in today's dollars. And so you want to spend time getting that, and that's something that you can initiate now. You don't need to wait until the municipality starts their charge. And one thing that's helped with recreation in particular is some municipalities hire a third party to vet and verify the unit costs for, say, building a new recreation complex, putting in an aquatic center, and the cost of developing various types of parks. It makes it a very strong way of moving forward, and it helps both with the inventorying and for the capital planning exercise. And that's the final point is, do you have a good sense of what your development related capital program needs are? So those are some things that you can be working on right now, even before the municipality begins to study. So the community benefits charge, and I think I've only got about 5 minutes left, It's this new piece of legislation, and Anne-Marie's going to speak a bit more about it as well. And it's a tool under Section 37 of the Planning Act. It's only available to lower tier and single tier municipalities, so not the upper tiers, but that doesn't affect you because Parks and Recreation are all at the lower tier or single tiers. It can work together with the development charges and parkland dedication to fund a variety of initial round capital costs associated with development. It's important to note that there's that same test that we have under the Development Charges Act, what we call a nexus, that says you have to show that the costs that you're recovering are related to development and related to the development that's going to be paying the charge. And as I indicated, it's only going to be applicable to 5-story buildings or 5 or more stories and that have more than 10 residential units. And that the charge that's levied against a particular development is not to exceed 4% of the site value. There's a requirement for a strategy, and Steve's going to speak, and we're going to speak a little bit about what that strategy might need to be. And so, as I said, these are largely untested, but it's going to be an important funding tool for some of you, and then there'll be other municipalities that don't consider or utilize it. So the strategy must contain a forecast of development, very similar to a development charge background study, must show the increased need arising from the development and redevelopment to which the CBCs will apply, and it has to meet some of those tests similar to the Development Charges Act. You have to net out benefit to existing, excess capacity, and other kinds of calculations. There's an adoption of a bylaw. Consultation is required, but is not very well defined under the legislation, which I think is a good thing because different municipalities will want to do it differently. You need to pass a bylaw, give notice of it, and once again, these bylaws will be appealable to LPAT as well. So there needs to be a fair bit of rigor. However, the CBC framework is not as all restrictive or prescriptive as the development charge legislation. So some of the key takeaways is that not all municipalities will implement a CBC, and certainly not all of them right away. I think most urban GTA municipalities and large single tiers will certainly implement a CBC because they need a replacement for the monies that they will no longer get under the Section 37 bonusing provisions of the Planning Act, which will disappear after 2 years. Also, some municipalities were funding some of the services that are no longer eligible for DC funding, such as parking. So those municipalities will definitely be looking at implementing a CBC. Outside of the GTA, many municipalities will, I think, have a wait and see approach. One, they may not have a significant amount of high density development, or they may be trying to attract that type of development, or they may let some of the other municipalities work through some of the tests and kinks behind doing a CBC background study. So once again, you should find out what your municipality is doing and make sure that you begin to think about the increased need for parks and recreation that arises from high density development. And I certainly think there are some bases upon which we can establish additional needs for high density development, in particular for park development needs in highly urbanized environments. Parkland dedication and cash in lieu. I'm going to leave Steve to get into the details because he's got some excellent experience on this and some very good examples. Basically, it's Section 42 of the Planning Act. It allows us to recover park conveyance at certain standard rates, 5% of the land area for residential purposes and 2% for commercial and industrial. And then there's this thing called an alternative rate, which can be set at 1 hectare per 300 units if you're taking land, or if you're going to do a cash in lieu payment, then the conveyance can be even higher. But those are maximum ceiling rates. And I must note that in some municipalities, those alternative rates can result in very high kind of contributions relative to the value of the site being developed. There's a lot of pushback from the development industry. Sorry, 1 in 500 is lower. I apologize for that. So what has changed? Some of the important changes that occur is that if a municipality is currently levying or wants to use an alternative rate, they have to update their bylaw by September of 2022. So there's sort of a 2-year transition period for most of these things. There's also additional requirements if you're going to pursue the alternative rate on consultation, notice of passage. You need to have policies within the OP, and the bylaw can be appealed to LPAT, which is something new. So you can see that all of these mechanisms have that rigor of needing to have the defensibility because they could get challenged before the tribunal. And then I'm going to leave some of this just for Steve because I know that I'm using up all of my time, and I just want to get to my final couple of slides. Just that there's a transition period of 2 years, and this is why you'll see some municipalities pursuing development charge updates sooner rather than later. So the deadline is September of 2022. I think most on this call probably recognize that municipal elections are in October of 2022. So many municipalities don't like to deal with development charge type issues during or close to the election. So many municipalities are looking to initiate studies now to have them completed by the end of 2021 or at the latest Q1 of 2022. So it's going to be a busy year next year, bringing all of these things in alignment. I would also like to suggest that there's real benefits in undertaking all of these 3 studies concurrently, because you can get a sense from my discussion that there's a fair bit of overlap between these things. I would also note that some municipalities won't proceed early. They'll just say, we don't need a CBC, we're not going to use the alternative rate, and we don't want to increase our DC rate, so we're just going to let things stay the way they are. And just to wrap up, if I can get to my final slide. So just some final thoughts. Figure out what your municipality is doing. Make sure you're plugged into that process. If possible, try to get yourself on the steering committee and certainly on the technical committee if your municipality has both. Begin work on those inventories and just be prepared to get ready for those studies. Thanks for the time, and I'll either take questions now or at the end of our time.
We don't have any questions at this point, Craig, but thank you for the very informative overview of some very dense legislation. And thank you for pointing out too that a lot of people were concerned that it was a now or never situation, and that it's, you have the 2-year transition, but the opportunity to implement some of these tools at a later date still exists. So that's great. Thank you. So I am now going to hand things over to Anne-Marie Nasser from the City of Toronto, and hopefully she'll be able to move through the slides. We'll just see if that's working. Excellent. Go ahead, Anne-Marie.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be on the panel and to hopefully hear some questions that people have, because I think we all have questions. So whether it's now or later, I think we want to start the conversation amongst municipalities around Bill 197. As Craig said, it's good news. The previous legislation through Bill 108 was really creating a really terrible situation for parks and recreation across Ontario, and it was not going to be revenue neutral, as we all knew. And, I think I learned a lot from working through PRO and with other municipalities about the strength of municipal alignment. And so I think that this panel session allows us to start building that when we're looking at the new tools. So I won't repeat what Craig said. Basically, we're looking at the 3 tools, DC, Section 42, and the new CBC. For Toronto, we will be advancing work on all 3 of the tools. And I think there is some great synergies because foundationally, they're based on a lot of the same information in terms of growth projections and looking at parkland and facility needs, which I'll describe in a bit. I'm not, oh, there we go. The challenges obviously is a timeline. As Craig mentioned, I don't think anybody would want to be putting something forward to council in September of 2022. So basically, if you backdate that to like a spring or early summer piece, it's really 18 months to basically pull all of this together, which is just, we're really challenged thinking that through, at least at Toronto. The appealability of all of the different tools exists, but frankly, I think municipalities can put themselves in a very strong position in terms of the rationale and work that they've done previously and can do to basically address municipal needs and how growth triggers the need for infrastructure and facilities and parklands. So yes, there is definitely the need to advance it quickly. But once again, I think some alignment and cross-pollination between municipalities will be really important for us to learn from one another as we get through this work. I'm not sure if I'm doing this correctly. Oh, there we go. I'm not sure if I jumped through. Okay, no. Okay, so one of the pieces that Toronto has already prepared is a parkland strategy. We did it with O2 Consulting and Hempson and and work from NBLC as well. And so we have basically what we would call our base park plan, and looking at basically how future growth affects parks across the city. Our park plan currently is looking at informing our land acquisition, our park enhancement, and our development review work. Given the scale of Toronto, we've looked at it as through a systems approach. I would actually argue it's a good way to be doing it, because once again, sometimes it becomes problematic and or challenging to buy land in high growth areas because of the cost. So when you look at a systems approach, if you layer transit over, sometimes you can buy parkland and get more bang for your buck in some other areas, but it's still addressing growth needs. The other thing that we did that is different, and it really speaks to the trends that are happening around 15-minute cities, is we looked at a park catchment tool. So we looked at the intensity of our existing parkland use, and so we did it through in terms of a walkability score. We looked at so in some areas of the city we may have 2,000 people around a park. So obviously the pressure on that park is massive, and our parkland strategy reflects that. In other cases, in our inner suburbs, we may only have 200 people. So basically, we were able to advance that type of thinking through our parkland strategy. And then just waiting for the other slide. There we go. So here's a map that shows the 2016 snapshot of our parkland strategy. And basically what you see is sort of the darker orange areas are higher needs. The green reflects our ravine system. And we did 2 layers of analysis. This one shows with ravines factored in and some access criteria around that. But what is interesting and was interesting for us is that the orange areas reflect both our high growth areas, but they also reflect where there has traditionally been not either a high provision of parkland, or the urban fabric in and of itself makes accessibility to parkland really challenging. And so that has really helped us in sort of articulating what future park plans should be and how we should be advancing even acquisitions within the areas to try and improve access to some areas that may have traditionally not had great access to parkland. From that, we basically layered, because we had to create a work program from our parkland strategy, and we looked at layering on low income, looking at high growth, looking at that traditional parkland provision. And we came up with areas that became priorities for us to assess parkland acquisition requirements, accessibility requirements, and inform some of the development work. Fortunately, we had previously done a deeper dive. So these are more local parkland plans that we are developing, once again, because of Toronto's scale and intensity of development and range of different urban contexts. We're using this to basically inform our work. Some of the work we've already done, we've done a local parkland plan for Yonge and Eglinton, and we've done a local parkland plan for the downtown. Both of those are interesting because they both took a very different approach to how we undertook the local parkland plan. So I think we've recognized that one size does not fit all, and you yourselves may find the same thing in terms of different contexts within your municipalities. The other piece that we did, and actually Monteith and Steve were our lead consultants on it, was the Parks and Recreation Facilities Master Plan. This basically identified a range of facilities from community recreation to outdoor ice rinks to arenas to sports fields and cricket pitches. it was a full gamut of recreation facility requirements across the city. And we were able to establish service levels and look at different benchmarks, including growth benchmarks, which was very helpful for us. And this will help us basically inform both our CBC strategy, our development charges background study, and it'll also inform our alternative rate, because in the end, we need the land to build the facilities to support the growth that's happening. So the parkland strategy will inform that, as will the facilities master plan. We integrated the first 10 years of this facilities master plan in our capital plan. And so we're then able to look at the projections of both the section 42 as well as development charges to basically plan and budget for the provision of these growth related projects. I won't get into it into detail, but basically here's the three tools that we have. We have a future potential to around development charges to capture the 10%, but we're still limited by the historic service level around section 42. I'll get into how we're approaching it. And then section 37 becomes a CBC. And for the city, 5+ stories basically triggers most of development. Close to 98% of our development is above 5+ stories and above the minimum threshold of units. So for us, all three tools are going to be required for us to even have a hope of keeping up with the growth infrastructure required to support development and build complete communities. So for the alternative rate consideration, our current alternative rate is capped. It was basically an agreement between ourselves, it was a mediated agreement between ourselves and the development community at the time. And I think it takes what I would say is a rear view approach. It created a snapshot of parkland need at a specific point in time. It basically created a rate and a cap. I do not recommend putting in a cap or just doing it as a snapshot in time if you're considering an alternative rate. What we're finding is that we need to be as agile and responsive to growth in the future as possible. And so we're looking at a tool now that basically figures out how we can align with future growth, where that growth will happen. And really, I think a lot of municipalities across Ontario are seeing that through transit, and maybe smaller municipalities are seeing that through additional subdivision and road infrastructure. So the question is that how do we basically hitch our wagon to those changes and basically address the parkland needs around that. So we'll be looking at kind of creating an entirely new framework for our new alternative rate. We'd be happy to talk to other municipalities if you're thinking the same. One of the issues that we're also being really pressured around is parkland quality. We're very committed to securing unencumbered resources, in part because in the future we'll end up putting facilities and we do not want to be encumbered by infrastructure underneath. And have the parks basically have to be replaced every 20 years or so. So basically that is what in our official plan actually. And then a location, size, and design also are factors that we are going to consider in terms of putting forward, at least for sure in our park plan and perhaps in our OP policies as well. So and then we go through the same challenges as a lot of other people do. We have growth areas where we pay a very significant amount for parkland. And then we have other areas where we get a bit more parkland for that value. So figuring out, once again, the systems approach to the alternative rate, I think will be important as well. So one of the things, and Craig covered it, is that we would look at the tools that we're used to using for community rec and park improvements. Includes both the DCs and Section 42. The CBC will also be a tool that we use. One of the questions that always comes up is we have to show that there's no duplication between the tools. One of the pieces is that no matter how much strongly we project growth in municipalities, there's always a challenge about new opportunities coming up. The Christie's lands, was employment, industrial lands, we still were able to replace the employment uses, but in a smaller footprint, unlocking future development. So as a result, it wasn't in our projections before for our DC bylaw, and so now we have an opportunity through Section 37 and hopefully through 42 to capture some of that unanticipated growth. So we're fairly confident that we can ensure that there is a seamlessness between the tools and try and use all of the tools. We'll see how successful we are, but that is definitely our intent. Apologies, there's a bit of a lag between slides, so I do apologize. There we go. So here's an example of a facility where we, and it was quite a while ago, where we used the variety of different tools, and we documented how we used Section 42, how we used Section 37 at the time, and how we used our DCs as well as some other funding. So that is something that we have been doing even with more recent examples. So I think that that's really important to note for everybody. So I think the takeaway is that we do have the tools that we've had previously. I think municipalities can decide which tools they want to advance or not. I think we recognize that they're all appealable and we have to do our due diligence. We also recognize that we have to engage with the development community and try and bring together as much as we possibly can a joint kind of vision around city building. I think intermunicipal collaboration is really important. I also believe that municipalities need to be thinking about these tools in a forward-thinking framework. I think when we look at our transit infrastructure, I know for us, Eglinton Connects, the LRT, when we look at Don Mills and Eglinton, our alternate rate didn't consider that as a growth area. Now with the LRT in place and not even open, we already have, close to 6,000 units approved at that intersection. So it shows you how forward-thinking we need our tools to be. And I look forward to connecting with municipalities that want to have further discussions on this. So I'll send it over to Steve.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. A great overview of what's happening in Toronto, and certainly prior, well, was it 2 years ago now? We had a meeting in Toronto that brought together planners and recreation professionals, municipal recreation staff from the GTHA, and it was incredibly useful for that sole purpose of just understanding what everyone was going to do with, at that time, what we thought was going to be a very restrictive tool. So we look forward to those discussions continuing. And I'll just say I know if we could see all the participants, they would be, I'm sure everyone's furiously writing things down. So we don't have any questions yet. So I am going to pass things over to Steve. So we were having issues with the lag on changing slides. So Steve, if this doesn't work for you, I'll be able to move the slides for you. Just, I'll follow your lead. So over to Steve with Monteith Brown. And if you just want to, oh, he's just saying, wait a second.
There we go.
All right.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Can you move the slide forward?
Yeah, no, I seem to be having the same issue
Okay.
was.
We'll just go back then. I will advance. And there we go.
Super.
All right.
Okay.
Over to you.
Well, thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure to be here. Take a moment to applaud everyone for sitting through a talk about DCs and Planning Act legislation on a beautiful Friday afternoon. So I'm going to try to get through this, and what you'll find, there's a bit of common ground, but as Craig and others have mentioned, this will be available to all attendees, I think, on the website after the fact. So be happy to respond to any questions that folks may have at the end of our time or after the presentation. So one of the things we have to remember is great park systems don't just happen, they are planned. Many of us dedicate our careers and our professional lives to this. The new legislation provides us, I think, a great opportunity to take a step back and take a look at how we build and manage our park systems. And I think one thing that the Bill 197 does is shines a light on how municipalities justify their parkland dedication. So, these are some questions that I think it's worthy of your departments asking themselves. Do you know what your community's parkland needs are today and into the future? Do you have strategies in place to meet these needs? And then let's start unpacking the legislation, whether it's changed legislation or what's been in place for a few years. Is it adequate for your needs? Can we leverage some of the tools that are available to us? Do your parkland dedication policies, are they up to date? And we won't cover any of this today. This is a whole other conversation, but fees and valuations are a very complex matter, changing very rapidly as market land values change. But that's sort of the deeper dive for another day, but that is part and parcel of how you deliver on the needs in your community. So next slide. Some of the, as Diane pulls that up, it's been a bit of a follow the bouncing ball here in terms of legislation over the last number of years. A lot of this is really brought on by higher intensity residential densities as the province and municipalities try to build up and not out, as well as the need to continue to provide for affordable housing options. So about 5 years ago, 2015-16, Bill 73 started to make some changes to the Planning Act, which had been really, the parkland dedication policies had been in use for several years prior to that. And that's when they started looking at reducing some of the alternate rate requirements and instituting the requirement for a parks plan. Fast forward to last year, we've already talked about some of the changes that were being proposed in Bill 108, and that would have really upended things. Fortunately, PRO and other organizations and municipalities advocated quite successfully, and this province moved away from that through Bill 197. And that's where we see it really keeps a lot of the elements that were in place for parkland dedication prior to, really historically, they remain in place with some tweaks, and that'll be a bit of the focus of the rest of my presentation. We've already talked about a little bit about CBCs, parkland dedication bylaws, and I'll touch on this again in a moment. That's where we see some of the changes, and I think there's a real on the ground opportunity for us there. Next slide. So trying to demystify the approach a little bit, I think we need to keep in mind when it comes to parkland dedication, everything needs to be in compliance with the frameworks that are in place. That framework starts with the Provincial Ontario Planning Act and extends to your community's local or in some cases upper tier official plan. Everything that you do needs to be in compliance with these. It's important to note as well that the parkland dedication bylaw, not every community has one. Not every community needs one, but again, with the way that we're seeing pretty substantial growth, really anything of a medium density growth or above. So we're talking townhouse type developments, row houses, certainly any apartments. You're getting into a density where there is a benefit to your municipality from a parkland dedication standpoint to look into adopting a bylaw. Next slide. So this is where Craig touched on a bit of this. I won't spend much time on the Planning Act tools. What I will say is, I think, and this comes up a few times in my presentation, it really depends on the context of your municipality. Are you a small rural urban municipality that is not seeing a lot of growth? or the growth that you're seeing is largely lower density, typical greenfield subdivision type of growth, you probably just take the 5% and move on. You may take cash in lieu. That's a choice that you have, and it's important to know that all of these tools are available to all municipalities. It's just whether they choose to enact them, whether they choose to follow through with their policies. I can certainly say we've seen a whole range of approaches. Very few municipalities do it the same way. Some of them have a practice that is very different from their policy as well. And that might be fine when you're dealing with some very local developers that you've dealt with for years. But as you're seeing more growth sort of coming out of the GTA or coming to your community, you might be getting new builders that are a little bit more sophisticated. So this is an area we really need to look at these policies and make sure that they're tight and that we understand how they're applied. So the alternative rate that's in place, cash in lieu, CVCs, all of these sort of are there to be a comprehensive spectrum of tools that you can utilize, but you can't use them all at the same time. So there's definitely a municipal choice that needs to be made, and that choice should be informed by, again, your policies and some of the criteria that you set, as well as your needs. And I'd be remiss to not mention, we recognize not all parkland comes through development. It's not just the Planning Act. We know the Planning Act does not provide really for all needs in a community. Some of the work we'll often cite, and it's been cited for many years, and you need to do your own local needs assessment to determine, but talking about sort of 2 to 3 hectares per thousand. I mean, that's been used when in many municipalities that have the need for sports fields because they're land intensive. The Planning Act tools will not get you to that point. They'll get you around 1, 1.2, could be substantially less if you have high density development. So they use other creative arrangements, just outright acquisition from general taxation. These are all approaches that need to be considered. Next slide. So I'll start reading ahead a little bit. Some common challenges that we do have, and again, I've mentioned municipalities deal with these things very differently. Some of them will have incentives. They'll put caps on dedication because they want to encourage development in certain parts of their community or certain types of development. Not all municipalities take the 2% for commercial or industrial. That's often their councils will view that as a disincentive to economic growth, but that is something that is available through the Planning Act. So, you know, we know legislation is changing. Some municipalities have outdated policies. They often get updated whenever next time you do your OP review is. But again, this is that opportunity. There is no one formula that works for determining your parkland requirements. So building your own case locally. Just as I mentioned on the last slide, Planning Act will not give you everything that you probably need unless you're already park rich, and that's a whole other discussion because it may not even be in the areas that you need it. And we know because of that, per capita provision levels are declining over time. If you're in a rapid growth community, you have less parkland per person than you probably had 10, 20, 30 years ago. So it's that high density area that's really challenging in most communities. So you've heard a bit of the Toronto experience. The land value is really rising. If you accept cash in lieu and you don't spend it right away because it's hard to, you need to collect it to a point, you lose buying power as it sits in your bank reserves. And when you come around to purchase the land, it's just, it's 50 cents on the dollar, 70 cents on the dollar. So, and these tools do very little for established areas. If you don't have the growth, the Planning Act is not going to necessarily help you with addressing any of your shortfalls. Next slide. This slide is more for the small communities out there. That's because we do see this when we talk about sort of outdated policies. Usually that 5% in a rural context is taken under section 51.1. So that's on the right side of the screen. This is your typical subdivision development. They'll take 5%. And the difference here between these two is the valuation. This one is valued on the day before draft plan approval. That's an unimproved lot. Think of a farm field. So you're getting 5%. If you're just taking the land, that's fine. But if you're taking the cash, you're getting it at a very lower rate than what section 42 offers, which is a fully serviced lot. So think of your subdivision, maybe with row houses, townhouses, semis. And you're taking a portion or all in cash in lieu. This will give you, you'd have to do your own valuation, but 2 or 3 times, potentially more bang for your buck. In order to use this section 42, again, most urban municipalities will have this, not all. It needs to be, well, both of these need to be in your official plan, but it also needs to be supported by a parkland dedication bylaw. So that'll, I think, segue to my next slide. I've really touched on this. Again, context matters, depends on the type of community that you have, the type of growth that you're seeing, and the types of decisions that need to be made. If you're park poor, you need the land. If you need a mix of land and cash in lieu, and cash in lieu can be used for park improvements, for capital items. It's not necessarily, it doesn't need to just be applied to parkland itself. So I'll just skip ahead to the next one if you could, Diane. So 2 tools that sort of work in connection with each other, as well as with your official plan, DCs, CBCs. The first one is parkland dedication bylaws. Municipalities will have this if they're taking the parkland at that richer rate, that section 42 rate. Many of these are quite old. Some have been updated with the changes in legislation. So not only do they allow you, in concert with your OP, to require cash in lieu or land at an alternate rate or higher value rate, they also establish protocols and policies for how you go about doing that. Some of them have criteria for how you choose lands. Again, that's a municipal decision. In the past, these parkland bylaws have not been appealable. And that's really been, there's 2 big changes. One is through the new Bill 197. If you have one of these bylaws in place, it is going to expire on September 18th, 2022, unless you choose to replace it. And you'd have to replace it with a new bylaw that complies with the latest legislation. If you do replace it, or if you create a new bylaw, it's going to be appealable to the LPAT, which is, think of the OMB for all intents and purposes. We don't know what the appeals are going to look like. We don't know how the criteria are going to be applied. They'll have pretty firm boundaries for the changes they can make, but they could very well reduce that alternative rate. So say you're taking 1 hectare per 300 units, they could choose based on the evidence to reduce that. And given the scrutiny that the development industry has had on these items lately, I think we have to be prepared to deal with appeals. Next slide. So what helps to defend us against these appeals? Preparing a parks plan. And it sounds like a shameless plug from a consultant, but I'll say, these things can be done in-house and done in-house quite effectively. We also answer our phone when we're called on these as well. So, but what it does is it examines needs and helps to provide that support that you need, either for your official plan, for your CBC, your DC even could tie in, as Craig had mentioned. The Planning Act does not define exactly how to go about doing these. So it relies more on best practices. There's a couple things in place that you do need, a couple boxes that you do need to check. Consultation with all school boards is one of those. And now the new legislation has brought in requirements for public notification, but that's like you would notify of any bylaw passing. But the appeal here is not for the parks plan itself, but the appeal mechanism is through the parkland dedication bylaw. Where possible, I've covered that, just coordinating, just more because there's a lot of the same data that feeds into this, and one piece of analysis might lead into other strategies that can be adopted within and across those various coordinated plans. Next slide. So I'm not going to read through each of these, but we've pulled together sort of I don't know if it's a 12-step plan, 15 steps, key tasks that we would undertake if you're looking at doing a parks plan, either yourself or with outside help. Not all of these need to be checked off, but should really be considered, at least by your municipality. These park plans, they don't always need to be under one cover either. They can sort of be a collection of documents and strategies that work together. So first phase is really just doing your research, and it's taking stock. I can't tell you how many municipalities we've seen that really don't know, have a full appreciation for what parkland they own or are responsible for. They know what grass they cut, but ownership and other and sizes of parks can sometimes be a real challenge. So yeah, take this time, do your research, figure out what you have and what some of those building demands might be, looking at distribution, looking at where your growth is. So all of this should occur part and parcel with your planning staff, and you'll get into coordinating with your finance staff as well. Next slide. So second phase would really be then sort of taking that information and making some choices based on it. Try to determine where you want your parkland provision targets to be, where are your gaps. Ideally, we like to, the Planning Act talks about parkland per unit to some degree. We like to plan on a per person basis, per capita basis. Parks are for people. So we tend to translate it to that sort of level. But this is the stage you'll make some decisions around what types of lands are acceptable. Will you consider strata parks? And Marie mentioned that. They come with their own host of issues. Will there be some areas that are exempted or have some caps on your parkland policy? Next. And then last step, although you might choose to do some of this throughout, is just consultation, community engagement. Usually your key stakeholders here are the development community, and again, the school boards, which is a requirement. And I imagine part of that's there because many of them are major provincial landowners, and they may have lands that have potential for parkland development, either through surplusing process or what have you. There are some reporting and monitoring requirements. Cash in lieu needs to be reported now out annually. So your finance department should be able to help with that. So 2 slides to wrap up, if I could. Some key takeaways on parkland dedication. If you have a parkland dedication bylaw in place, talk to your planning department about this. They may be closer to some of the details. Look at what your policy gaps are, and I'm going to assume you're going to want to update your bylaw within that 2-year time frame. You will need a parks plan of some ilk to help support that. If you do not have a parkland dedication bylaw, you may consider preparing one at any time. This is your choice. It doesn't need to be between now and 2022, but just keep in mind it triggers the ability to use some of these tools that may not be otherwise available to you. And just really the last point on this slide, positioning parks as essential services. I think this is a good segue to the next and last slide I have. We know that the benefits of parks are wide ranging. They help to achieve other corporate objectives. And what we're seeing through the pandemic, I mean, they're more important than ever. We think there's probably some very concrete ways that the pandemic may end up impacting parkland provision. All of these are worth monitoring, so this is just more anecdotal at some point. There's been some good research out there, though, to support that greater use of greater casual use of parks has come out of this time, trying to connect outdoors, more unstructured, all ages, backgrounds, time of day, getting out and trying to be physically active as other avenues are less available to folks. We know that the impact on mental health, physical well-being is strong. So it's a great time to strike while the iron is hot, I suppose, for that on that public support around investment in parks. We know interest is there for close to home activities as well. So, you know, your parks plan will look at distribution. Do you have local options in all neighborhoods? And key strategies are needed to address that. More parkland space. Certainly we're seeing this on the indoor side. You know, you need space to distance. Indoor activities being moved outdoors all sort of builds the case for investing in quality parks. And then broadening, you know, we're seeing a broadening of informal park spaces, talk about open streets being one of those. I really wonder if the use of non-traditional spaces might sort of provide the key for unlocking some of our historic park shortfalls. They're not going to give us the big green lush spaces that we're used to, but they are part of this continuum of park within the park system that can help us really key in on some shortfalls that we've been dealing with. And lastly, you know, I think to underscore what we're seeing here in southwestern Ontario, a lot of the smaller communities are really seeing pretty rapid growth. And they're becoming more attractive. Part of this was pre-pandemic. Part of it is also from, you know, because of work from home and lifestyle changes. I would really, you know, I think this is a call for those mid-sized to small communities to really look at their park policies and make sure that they're poised to address all those needs that are coming, that they need to through the growth process. So right at 2 o'clock, and I appreciate everyone who stayed in, and put it back to Diane for any questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. And you know, you brought to mind the concept of a connected hierarchy of green spaces, which are so important in communities, so that you have those tiny pocket parks. And I know Toronto's been doing some amazing work with pocket parks and parks that are on private land in the downtown core. So it's that hierarchy of green space, so important. We did have one question, and Steve, you might be best to answer this in regard to someone asked, how many municipalities are actually able to get the 5%? For, you know, in your experience, what's I think that was sort of said with tongue in cheek, but
well, I think everyone gets 5%, whether they choose to take it as cash or choose to take it as land. You know, in those higher density scenarios, the land is not always available. I mean, they tend to look more at that alternative rate in that case. The 5% historically has really been there for a lot of the subdivision, low density growth. And, you know, that does tend to come the municipality's way. But I think I mentioned it, but just trying to make a strategic decision around whether you actually are taking, you know, we see a lot of municipalities that take the land all the time. And then they end up with very small parcels, not even a neighborhood park. And there's a high maintenance cost to that. They find there's another park nearby, and then they don't become really much of a place for respite for the community. So, you know, what they can do instead is be a little bit more strategic, plan on a secondary or block level basis, try to match those two smaller parks together into a larger one, or you take cash, you reinvest in the spaces that you have, or you purchase land where you need it.
yeah. You know, you mentioned the importance of a park plan and now appealable, you know, appealable bylaws. And I think that's really important because in the past, parks plans have been vital in fighting off appeals in some communities. So I think, you know, it's really important to, as you said, to have that in place, even if you think, well, you know, don't need it now. It's not, you know, there's not much competition. There could be, for sure, in the future, the need for that. So thanks. I'm just going to ask all of our presenters, please, to turn their cameras back on so that we can say thank you. I don't have any more questions, and maybe just last thought. I'll go to you first, Anne Marie. Last thought on what municipalities, large and small, can take away from this.
Well, I think the reality is there's a great opportunity before all municipalities, and it's just a matter of a lot of hard work, though, too. And I think keeping connected and learning from one another is the way forward, because those who decide to move these tools forward and advance plans and bylaws will all be at the same place, close to at the same time. So some of those, having those discussions and learning from one another, I think is a good way forward as well.
Thanks. And Craig, from your perspective, in terms of now seeing DCs, without the 10% reduction and what's the biggest opportunity you're seeing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very positive that we're going to have the opportunity to collect more money, and we see the synergies between the different tools. I would like to build on a couple of comments that Steve has made, is that with this, the development industry is going to engage even more in our studies. And I don't want to put off small and medium-sized municipalities, because there's a lot that you can do just to anchor and shore up your parks plans, your internal works, your capital needs. But you really should do that. It's going to be helpful for the processes. And if you need to bring in someone such as myself or Steve to help out, flesh out some of those things, but there's a lot that you can do yourselves. And I do think there's going to be a range of detail that different municipalities do, and it's going to be defensible and workable under the legislation.
Great, thank you. And Steve, the last thought?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, let's, I'd like to be optimistic and think that most developers, most applicants for development approvals also want parks. It's a quality of life feature. It helps to sell their units. It contributes to a complete community. So, sometimes when we get into the black and white of these policies, you worry, and you worry about defending it. You think it's going to be that appeal and it's going to be the butting of heads. But ultimately, we find there's a lot of common ground here. You require a lot of creativity within the bounds of the tools and the policies that you have in place. But at the end of the day, it's about creating sort of those great park spaces that define the community and make it resonate for its residents.
Okay, thank you. And thank you once again to our presenters, Craig Binning, Anne-Marie Nasser, and Steve Langlois. And thank you to everyone who participated in today's webinar. Again, my name is Diane English. I'm the Director of Policy and Communications. I know this is tough slogging because it's detailed and it's very administrative in nature, but it is so important for our sector to use these tools and to take advantage, because where we were a year ago is not where we are now. Regardless of the pandemic, we are in a much better position to fund parks and recreation in some ways, especially through DCs and hopefully through continued use of parkland dedication tools. So I look forward to future conversations, and I wish everyone a fantastic weekend. And thank you once again to our presenters.